the people involved. I am hosting it from Cambridge, and we have as our moderator today, Professor Corneliu Bjola, and he's at Oxford University and is speaking from Oxford. And then from Tokyo, Japan, our main speaker, Professor Yasushi Watanabe of Keio University. And if we can move on to the next slide, I'll just briefly say a few words about them. Professor Bjola is Associate Professor in Diplomatic Studies at the University of Oxford and head of the Oxford Digital Diplomacy Research Group. I won't read out the whole of this page, but I will talk hopefully for long enough for you to see what Professor Bjola does. So he has positions at the University of Southern California and at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. Is a particular specialist on the impact of digital technology on diplomacy. And he's got a book about to come out. And then moving on to what I think is the final slide, our main speaker is Professor Yasushi Watanabe. So he's Professor of Public Diplomacy at the Graduate School of Media and Governance at Keio University in Tokyo. And he has a PhD from Harvard and has also done research at both Cambridge and Oxford, and was actually a fellow at Downing College, University of Cambridge in 2007. And he has some books out as well, which are listed at the bottom. And you can see that in 2005, he was awarded the Japan Academy Medal, the highest national prize awarded to mid-career academics in Japan. So on that note, I'm going to pass over to Professor Corneliu Bjola to make a few remarks and get us started.
Thank you very much, Jason, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for joining us. It's a great occasion to reconnect with Professor Watanabe. We had the pleasure to I had the pleasure to host him last year in Oxford for a talk on Japan soft power, and I thought it would be interesting to revisit the issue in the current context, soft power in the context of the crisis of the pandemic. And I think it's an interesting concept, an interesting discussion, simply because when we talk about soft power, we talk generally in a positive context. Joseph Nye, who of course coined the term, talked about soft power as the power of attraction. Attraction to what? Attraction to the culture, attraction to the institution, or attraction to the policies of a particular state. So for Nye, the idea was that there are certain points, certain attractors, certain points of attraction, these institutions, these policies, this culture of a state towards for the foreign public. So it's a positive context usually when we talk about soft power. But how to talk about soft power in the context of a crisis like the pandemic, where everything, when you look around, is so gloomy, right? The news mentioned, the death rates every day in the tens of thousands. We talk about economic disruption similar to the Great Depression. So the numbers are staggering. So to what extent it actually makes sense to comment on soft power and to discuss about soft power in such conditions? And what I try to suggest before I hand it over to Professor Watanabe is that still I think there are certain interesting attractors, point of attractors. And I'm going to briefly mention 4 of them, which I think can matter. So the first one, what we've seen is how, the first attractor is how a state manages the crisis. And let me share with you a poll that was published recently by The Guardian. Sorry, where is not this one. That's a problem with the sharing. Can you see it?
We can see that fine.
Okay. So it's a poll that was taken in UK about British citizens. How do they feel about their own government comparing with other countries? Have the UK government handled the crisis better than, for instance, US? And I think that's the perception that in US, where about 1/3 of the total number of deaths they count now, they happened in US. and a little bit than Italy and Spain. But look, for instance, the case of let me see if I can use this. The case of China, the case of France, and of course, Germany, to a certain extent, South Korea. So there is a perception, of course, in UK that actually the situation is quite different. You have a number of countries that actually have managed the situation quite well. But we also have to ask ourselves, what does it mean when we say, well, we think that the Chinese government managed the crisis better? Does it create a point of attraction? Is that the admiration for the way in which for the Chinese institutions? I doubt that. What I think it matters when you look at this is that people appreciate, and I think it's important, appreciate a return to competence, a return to fact-based policies. I think this is probably one lesson that may draw from this crisis, that all the discussion with populism and mistruths somehow is being sidelined, and the return of competence, the return of expertise, the return of fact-based policies, I think, is one attractor. The second point, which I think it's also, and Professor Watanabe is going to mention, it's the question of international collaboration. One unfortunate development during this period has been the problem of lack of leadership, right? We still have the institutions, the G20s, the World Health Organization, and so on. But they haven't, except for the World Health Organization, the others haven't actually performed well, been paralyzed because of the lack of leadership. And the question is, to what extent this kind of assistance to countries affected by the pandemic could actually serve also as a point of attraction. We also have to think about the aftermath, the economic crisis, and that probably makes us recall the experience of the G20 in 2009, how it managed to raise to the expectation and to produce that type of international framework in which countries managed to collaborate to deal with the consequences of the crisis in 2009. And I think this is another important lesson in which countries could take the initiative and to provide that type of leadership that is necessary, not only to deal with the pandemic crisis, but also with the aftermath, the economic disruption. And finally, which I think is also important to consider, it's a new development. The pandemic has been also the first digital pandemic. We've seen a lot of disinformation happening. Massive disinformation. Not only strategic, there have been accusations against Russia for trying to stir up trouble in Europe, but also recent studies that have been published shown actually that there is a lot of disinformation that is being promoted by domestic actors. I'm just referring, for instance, to something in UK, the 5G conspiracy. So I think another point of attractor that might be relevant to discuss is how countries deal with disinformation. Are they slipping into this kind of more authoritarian surveillance mode, or they are still able to harness this power of the liberal institutions to deal with this in a more positive way? So these are the points that I wanted to highlight before I introduce Professor Watanabe. In terms of how to think, maybe even in this kind of negative context, about soft power. What does it mean for the state? Does it have the competence, the policies, the factual policies to deal with this? Is it able to produce, to contribute internationally to assistance to countries affected by the pandemic? Is it able to take the initiative to deal with the economic crisis? And also, of course, how it's able to cover the problem of this, to cope with the problem of disinformation. One last thing before I stop, I have a little poll, because the poll that was done by Guardian didn't include Japan. So I thought that in the context of what I just mentioned, it would be interesting to for our audience to give their opinion, expression about how Japan could actually improve or take this into account to boost its soft power. So here's the poll. I'm going to launch it now. I hope you can all see it. So there are 5 questions that I like you to, you can pick one of them. It's how Japan managed the crisis, what do you know about, maybe you read in the news, whether it can provide assistance programs to countries affected by the pandemic, support for international organizations. The World Health Organization has done a good job, but has come under siege as well. It's part of the blame game that is happening. The G20 initiative, this is something to consider in the context of the economic, the disruption that is happening. And maybe you have some other ideas. And because the poll feature doesn't allow us for you to type in your answer, maybe you can use the chat if you wish so to give us our views about other ways in which this can happen. I'm going to leave the poll open. Then I'm going to invite Professor Watanabe to give his presentation. And I'm going, before the Q&A, to share with you the results of the poll. All right? Thank you.
Okay. So thank you, Corneliu, for the very thoughtful opening remark. And actually, we're supposed to meet you in Tokyo around this time, but I'm glad to get together with you, at least online. Also, thank you, Jason and the Daiwa Foundation for organizing this event and having me. I'd like to begin by offering a quick snapshot of the situation in Japan. In Japan, the first patient was discovered on January 16, who had just returned from Wuhan, China. And then on February 3rd, the British cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, arrived at Yokohama Bay. The ship became a cluster of infection, and Japan was criticized for not taking a prompt action and for keeping the passengers too long on board. Although, frankly, I don't know if there were any better choices at that time. As some of you may know, the mid-February is a high season for entrance examination in Japan, but almost all the schools managed to do it as scheduled. But 1 month later, most schools canceled commencement. And in April, most schools canceled entrance ceremony and postponed the new semester. And actually today was the first day of class at my university. And of course, all the classes are offered online. The state of emergency was issued on April 7th, but in our case, it is a mild lockdown. You're just urged to stay home and work from home and avoid free seats, which means close contacts and crowded places and closed spaces. But otherwise, it's not compulsory, and there's no penalty. And now experts are urging to reduce human contacts by 80%. And they say that if we can make it, we should be able to see a sharp drop of infection number only in a few weeks. I'm often asked if there's any sort of Japan model in dealing with COVID-19. And I would say it's probably the so-called cluster-based approach. I mean, Japan has focused on controlling the outbreak by going after clusters of infections in places like clubs, gyms, and meeting venues. And just to update you, the number of infected cases in Japan is about 14,000. And Japan's population is 127 million people, which is about twice that of the United Kingdom. So it's relatively low. And back in March, I often heard a warning that Tokyo could be another New York only in a few weeks. But so far, the overshooting doesn't seem to have occurred. But each country has a different protocol about testing. So I'm not sure if it makes sense to focus too much on the infection number and compare it with other countries. Rather, I'd like to pay more attention to the mortality rate per capita. As of today, the death toll in Japan is 435, again, out of 127 million people. As you can see on the chart on the screen, it's fairly low in comparison with peer countries. The British data is before the number at the care home was taken into account, so it could be a little higher than this. No one really knows why the death rate is low in Japan, and some attribute it to the cluster-based approach, and some to the healthcare system in Japan, or to Japan's habit of wearing masks, or Japan's zoning culture. I mean, we tend to prefer bowing rather than shaking hands and hugging and kissing, or to social norm of keeping quiet on public transportation. But again, it's still too early to tell. And experts say the number of infections and deaths haven't peaked out yet. And there are a number of untraceable cases as well. Also, in central districts of Tokyo and Osaka, some hospitals are overwhelmed by patients and increasingly turning away sick people. So general atmosphere in Japan is still tense and nervous. So in Japan, we are now in the so-called Golden Week, which is a 2-week holiday season. And usually people travel around the country, but now we call it the stay-home week. And the place where I live usually are flooded with tourists, but I see very few people. It's quite unusual holiday season indeed. And here in Japan, mass media constantly report on various efforts by other countries. And South Korea is praised for their drive-through testing systems and isolated community treatment centers for mild cases, and also successful implementation of their national elections just a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. The same is true with Taiwan, and especially the government's good control of masks and sanitizers. And as you know, they sent an early warning about this new virus at the end of last December to WHO, but unfortunately, it was not taken seriously by WHO. And places like South Korea and Taiwan experienced SARS and MERS in recent past, so they were very well prepared and quick to respond this time. And also, New Zealand is often praised for taking a very strict lockdown, even stopping all the airplanes and trains and so on. And also, Germany is well regarded for their very functional healthcare systems and generous compensation schemes for lost income. All these places put trust on experts and deliver science-based policies. Also, they're good at using a personal tracking system, and also the political leaders sound empathetic and coherent in their messages. So in this sense, US appears to be on the opposite end of the spectrum. But each country has a unique circumstance, so it's hard to compare and make a moral judgment here. Also, there might be the second wave or third wave of infection, so it's still too early to conclude. If you do well, your country image certainly improves and makes a good model for the future pandemics. But as Corneliu mentioned, I'm not sure if it goes any further than that. I mean, if it makes a strong soft power in moving and shaping the international relations. Actually, in terms of soft power, what is most intriguing to me is how this COVID-19 crisis affects the hegemonic rivalry between the US and China. And I guess everyone on this webinar is familiar with name calling between the two countries. And the US calls the COVID-19 the Wuhan virus or Chinese virus, whereas China claims it was initially brought in by the US forces. Both countries are trying to maintain the aura of competence around their own work and undermine confidence in the other side. This kind of information warfare is certainly fun to watch in terms of public diplomacy. But to me, the most interesting case so far is mask diplomacy by China. And China has sent masks and protective clothes and testing kits and ventilators to almost 130 countries and several international organizations. And the medical team have been dispatched to places like Italy and Pakistan and Laos and Myanmar. And actually, these are the key countries for China's Belt and Road Initiative. And medical gears were provided not only to Italy, but also to Spain as well. And these are the countries not necessarily well helped by European Union. So this could be a golden opportunity for China to drive a wedge among European countries. And actually, China has increased influence not only at WHO, but also at UNESCO and IAEA and FAO and IKO and other international organizations. So given that China is not a liberal democracy based on the rule of law, the rise of Chinese soft power over this COVID-19 crisis and beyond is a little concerning. And it's particularly so when the US is turning away from multilateral engagement, and as Corneliu mentioned, when there's no obvious leaders in the world arena. And China could be the de facto leader in the end. Also, other democratic countries seem to have softened their criticism of China for fear of heavy pressures from Beijing. And in the meantime, Beijing is tightening its political grip on Hong Kong and expanding activities, military expanding activities in East and South China Seas, while international community is busy with this corona crisis. So I'm keeping an eye on China's soft power strategy, not despite of corona crisis, but because of that. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Watanabe. It was a very comprehensive and elaborate presentation on the situation of Japan's managing of the crisis. So before we open the floor for questions, let me share now the results with you of the poll. So what we've seen here, and it was interesting to see why Professor Watanabe was mentioning the efforts done by Japan to manage the crisis, how the numbers were changing upwards on the first option, Japan's management of the crisis. I think what this tells me is that still a number of people don't know much about how Japan managed the crisis. I think there is a interesting story there to present as well. The first option, as you see, it's more about assistance programs. And I think probably, Professor Watanabe, I think you already mentioned the mask diplomacy done by China in Europe, which had mixed results actually. For at the beginning, it was welcome, and then it was seen, and Russia has done something similar in Italy, has been seen a little bit as overreach in terms of the public engagement part. So the reaction here at the beginning, yes, of course, we like this kind of collaboration, but I think it was very much done in a more propagandistic fashion. And I think here, the calibration is important. I remember after the Haiti earthquake that the successful cases of this kind of assistance imply a partnership between governments and private actors. And I think this is probably a lesson here to remember that the more the government is taking a leading role in providing this kind of assistance, sometimes it's seen more as a PR exercise, but more that if you bring other actors, other stakeholders into the fold, I think that the impression changes. Surprised to see the situation with the the World Health Organization, not very popular at the moment. But at the same time, there is an opportunity, I think, at least for the audience, for our audience to for the G20 to become a platform in which Japan actually can take a leading role in creating or developing a program of economic rejuvenation. There were some comments here as well on the others talking about SDF deployment of field hospitals. I think it goes in the same direction with this kind of medical support. So very interesting results, on my side.
For today, I think it just remains to thank all of the speakers and indeed all of the questioners and people who've been contributing on the chat. Sometimes we've had more than one conversation going on at once, but I think that's fine. There's plenty to talk about here. We didn't, I think, come to any hard and fast conclusions about who is going to come out stronger at the end of all of this. But of course, it really is too early to do that. But I think we at least had a very interesting chat about it and got some first thoughts on the subject. So thank you all very much.